My name is Cindy Domingo, and I'm with LELO and U.S. Women in Cuba collaboration. And I'm just going to moderate today. And welcome to our two speakers, Pete Bohmer from Evergreen State College and Marti Schmidt from the National Lawyers Guild. So how this forum came about is Juan Bocanegra, who is not here today, and who disappeared after our first meeting, brought us together, and we all have a common interest around Venezuela. And it was a couple of weeks after the demonstrations started happening in Venezuela. And we noticed through different forms of social media that people on the left were confused about what was happening in Venezuela, much less people who have not followed events or the history of events in Venezuela. So we thought it would be important to have this forum to discuss what has historically happened in Venezuela and what has led to the current events in Venezuela, and an analysis and a discussion about Venezuela today, because if we depend solely on our media or Venezuelan media, you will not get the accurate picture of what is happening in Venezuela and the accomplishments that have happened under the Bolivarian revolution. So that is why we decided to have this discussion and presentation. Marti was recently in Venezuela for the December elections, the municipal elections. And Peter has been there off and on for a number of years, bringing students from Evergreen. And I've been there 3 times, a couple of times for international women's conferences held under when President Chavez was there, and one on another tour. So, but I haven't been there for a number of years. That's why they're the key speakers. So, without further ado, we'll start.
Great. So I want to thank Cindy, and I want to thank all of you for coming. So there are 2 different stories about Venezuela. One view is that protesters that are going on now are part of this worldwide movement, such as going on in Turkey, Chile, Egypt in 2011, the Ukraine, against an increasingly repressive and poorly functioning system. The protesters want supposedly more democracy, less corruption, and an economy where goods are available. My view is quite different. That's what I'm going to focus on mainly today. It's based on my study and teaching about Venezuela and Latin America and taking classes, as Cindy mentioned, over 30 students each from Evergreen State College, where I teach political economy. I took class there in Venezuela for 2 months each in 2009 and 2012. And I spent another 2 months there besides that between 2009 and 12. So first, a little context. Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela in 1998 and died a year ago in office after having been re-elected president 3 times. His death was a major loss for Venezuelans and people all around the world who are concerned about economic justice and a world not dominated by global capitalism in the U.S. Yet it's wrong to reduce our analysis or opinion of Venezuela to Chavez, whether pro or con. More important to me is the changes in the daily lives of the people of Venezuela, culturally, politically, and economically. And that's going to be my focus today. The popular classes of Venezuela, which to me is 80% of the population, they're basically workers in the informal and formal sector, the unemployed, small businesses, small business people, campesinos, have improved their lives significantly, not just economically, but also by their inclusion in society. There's been a drop in poverty since '98 of over a half, and extreme poverty by 70% since Chavez's victory. The access to education, the increased access to education and health care has been huge. This has also been true in terms of access to food and food security. There's been a major increase, for example, in caloric intake from about about 2,000 to 3,000 calories per person per day, and both the quality and quantity of food has increased. An Olympia, Washington resident who recently spent 2 years in a low-income barrio in Barquisimeto, Venezuela, recently mentioned to me he sees more hunger in a nearby Washington community, Shelton, Washington, where he currently works, than he did in the Barquisimeto barrio where he lived. Not only have the number of poor people declined so significantly in Venezuela, the formerly excluded, the large majority of the population are now involved in controlling their community and public resources. There are 40,000 communal councils in Venezuela. These communal councils democratically decide how to spend and manage a significant amount of public revenues. There's also been major land distribution or redistribution both in the countryside with the availability of credit and also access to education and health care in rural areas as well as the cities. The economy there is still dependent on oil, but unlike earlier periods of Venezuelan history, the oil is now being used to meet people's needs and to a limited extent to build infrastructure and increase new production, agriculture, clothing, communication, aluminum, transportation, oil and farm equipment, etc. The intent is there to increase production of goods, and there's been some growth, although as I'll get to more, it's been quite slow. Venezuela has not been successful in maintaining sustained, continued, and solid growth, neither in key industries including agriculture, nor in a continual growth in the number of self-managed or worker-controlled enterprises, but there have been improvements. Venezuela, for example, has gone from being one of the most unequal countries in the world in the 1990s in terms of income and wealth distribution to today, where it's the most equal country in the Americas. Gini coefficient is an economics and economists measure inequality. The lower the better. Venezuela today is around 40. This is, for example, much lower than the United States, which is about 47 out of 100, although it's still more unequal than, for example, the Scandinavian countries. Nicolas Maduro was elected president of Venezuela in October 13 in a very close election. Previously, he was a bus driver, labor organizer, foreign minister, and then after the 2012 election, he was the vice president. As far as I can tell, his politics, perspectives, and vision for Venezuela seem similar to Chavez, what's called socialism for the 21st century, the synthesis of socialism and democracy with a very strong anti-imperialist politics. Maduro is taking crime seriously and for the most part demonizes the opposition less than Chavez did. He has majority support, but not the same love from the people that Chavez had. So I'm going to turn now, there are some serious problems in Venezuela, okay? The problems that the U.S. mainstream focuses on, they're real, but I'm going to argue they're overstated, okay? So 3 problems that, from reading Times, Seattle Times, New York Times, CNN, watching CBN. So these are the 3. One is inflation. So inflation is a real problem. It's not new, but inflation in 2013 was 56% last year, which means prices grew by over half in 1 year. But still, even in spite of this really high inflation, poverty has continued to decline in 2013. Inflation has averaged about 25% a year since 1998, even though it was even higher in the 1990s, so it's just not, something new. Most but not everyone's wages increased at the same rate of inflation. This means the real wage has been maintained. The minimum wage has gone up roughly the same as inflation over the last 2 years. Most people in the informal sector, which is still about 40% of the labor force, although much less than before '98, they can raise prices of their goods as other prices rise, thus maintaining their real income. By informal sector, I mean more or less people of all ages selling goods on the streets, in buses, at markets, and small stalls, etc. Fundamentally, inflation in Venezuela is caused by an economy organized around oil still, Well, oil generates significant income, both for workers in the oil and related sectors, but also it funds the social programs, and that leads to spending. So this general spending of oil revenues is inflationary because production in other sectors hasn't grown sufficiently to match the increased demand that people have. So prices continually rise. This spurs imports, as there's not enough domestic production, which ends up being cheaper than domestically produced goods. For example, because of the continual rise in prices in Venezuela, it's cheaper to buy goods, for example, rice from Colombia, than grow it at home. Venezuela exports very little besides oil, as Venezuelan goods are too expensive to export at the going official exchange rate of the bolivar, which is the money there, to the dollar. In order to limit inflation, prices from going even more than they have been, Venezuela has tried to fix the rate of its currency to the dollar, fearing that devaluing the dollar, meaning increasing bolivars to the dollar, would increase the cost of living as the price of imports would rise. The Venezuelan government has limited the convertibility of its currency, in other words, trading bolivars for dollars to prevent capital flowing out of the country. So it has tried to limit the convertibility of the currency. But consequently, what's happened, and this has been a growing problem, is the black market for dollars has run parallel to the official exchange rate. So the official exchange rate is 6 bolivars to the dollar. But the black market rate, when people, if you, for example, go there and you have dollars, people will offer you, like in hotels, on the street, it reached about 90 bolivars to the dollar by February 1st. Okay, so it reached about 90 to the dollar. The official rate is 6. The black market rate is 90. And we can discuss this more in discussion if people want more, but the high exchange rate for the dollar is fueled by the government only selling limited amounts of dollars to people who need them. They're going to travel abroad, importers, and so on. And there's also been intense speculation against the bolivar. In other words, betting the value of the bolivar will continue to fall and the dollar will rise by buying dollars of bolivars. They're trying to sell them as, get more and more bolivars for the dollar. So lots of money can be made by getting dollars at the official rate of 6 to the dollar. For example, suppose you say you're going to travel, so you can get from the government, you give bolivars, you get dollars, and then selling the dollars instead on the black market for 50 to 1, 60 to 1, 90 to 1. So you buy them, you basically are giving 6 bolivars to get dollars, and then you can get 90 to 1 by selling the dollars to get bolivars back. So you're making just an incredible rate of profit, of course, for people who have money to do that. Also, importers of goods, you can buy goods, right, paying 6 bolivars to the dollar. You can buy goods cheaply abroad and then selling these goods, and this has been happening with huge markups of the price in Venezuela, which further fuels inflation. So the government has decided in the last month, since early March, to try to make dollars more available to people through government, banks, and through other ways, their foreign exchange agencies, at a close to market determined rate. So this action may break the speculation against the bolivar and substantially lower the black market price for dollars. It's probably necessary, even though it does lead to some necessities going up in price. And the price of the dollar on the black market has fallen to about 55 to 1 from 90. So I think that's an improvement. It's still a huge difference. Someone recently mentioned to me, who was in Venezuela in January, that if one uses the official rate of 6 bolivars to the dollar when buying local currency, Venezuela is the most expensive country in the world. If you use the black market rate, $60 or more, it's probably the cheapest country in the world for somebody who's coming from another country. Okay, so one problem, inflation, the currency. Second problem, shortages. So there have been increases in the shortage of goods over the last year or two in Venezuela. Flour, cooking oil, toilet paper, those are the 3 that are often mentioned the most. People often have to wait in line many hours to purchase needed goods, both at the private stores and the government-subsidized food stores. It's a real inconvenience. I don't want to say it's just trivial, but again, to put it in context, there is no hunger or generalized shortage of food as a whole, so you may not be able to get pork, but you can get something else. Even in 2013, a year of really high inflation, the highest since the change in '98, and increased shortages, real consumption for the population did increase in Venezuela. Okay, so again, I'm trying to put them in context. So for both inflation and shortages, increased domestic production of food and other goods is essential in the long run to end the mismatch between growing demand. There's been growing demand, which is also the result because the popular classes, their purchasing power has increased, their incomes have gone up, there's more decent paying jobs. So you've had an increase of people's purchasing power and a much slower increase in supply of goods, which has been a weakness of the revolution there over the last 15 years, okay? So the third problem, besides the inflation and shortages, is crime. So crime is a real and serious problem. There's a very high both murder and robbery. And I guess I'm talking about violent crime here. It's not new. It's something that didn't start, in '98. And it's not clear to me if it's risen significantly in the last few years, but it is high. And as I mentioned already, Maduro is taking crime seriously. I think with Chavez, it was so much used by the right wing, plus he had the view, which I think most of us have, poverty's declined so much, crime would really decline, street crime would really decline. That has not been true in Venezuela. On the other hand, some possible hopes, a new national police force would be formed because the police commit a lot of the crime themselves, hopefully to replace the violent, inefficient, and often brutal and criminal police force. The new police universities, some of which I visited, are stressing respect for human rights and more effective policing of violent crime. Also, and this isn't general, in those barrios where there are a lot of cultural activities for youth, where there are activities, violent crime, which is mainly committed by young men, has decreased significantly. All three of these social and economic problems can't be blamed solely on the destabilization caused by the Venezuelan elites in the U.S. Certainly the U.S. has done this type of economic stabilization in the past, for example, in Chile in the early 1970s and Nicaragua in the 80s. The U.S. is a factor and a very negative factor in Venezuela, and we should oppose it at home, but it probably isn't the main cause of these problems. A partial cause of the problems of shortage and inflation stems from holding back supplies of consumer goods by suppliers and retailers, either waiting for prices to rise further or to further dissatisfaction with a government they bitterly oppose. So that's a little more in the context of the problems. I want to turn now to the causes of the protests. So the street protests began in Venezuela about 2 months ago, early February 2014. I want to stress there are some legitimate grievances of many of the protesters, the reasons I already mentioned. There are also continuing problems in Venezuela of nepotism, corruption, bureaucracy, and government inefficiency. The university students who are protesting and are getting so much attention in U.S. social and mainstream media, however, are not from the universities where the popular classes and their children attend, what are called the Bolivarian universities, which are these new, socially conscious universities that have really grown since 2003. The student protesters are from the private universities and from what are called autonomous universities like the Central University in Caracas, the University of the Andes in Merida. These universities, although public, draw primarily from the kind of professional upper classes, middle and bigger businessmen. And the student movements, there are student movements there that are pretty significant that oppose the ongoing social change in Venezuela. Their grievances are primarily about society, although most of the protesters also oppose opening their universities to the popular classes. Students have been part of anti-government protests in Venezuela, including the more violent ones. They're certainly not the only ones protesting, but they have been all the ones. The leadership of the protests, and I want to stress this, is really the right wing of Venezuela. It's really the right wing of Venezuela, even to the right of Enrique Capriles, who's the governor of Miranda, and he was the 2012 and 2013 opposition candidate for president. They include, for example, people like Maria Corina Machado and Leopoldo Lopez, both who were active in the failed 2002 coup against the Chavez government. and they're leaders today of the small and right-wing party called the Popular Will Party. They've made it clear their intent is to overthrow the government of Venezuela, what they call La Salida, the leaving of the government, and move Venezuela far to the right, to what I would call an authoritarian neoliberalism, just looking at some of their documents. A February 12, 2014 protest that Leopoldo Lopez spoke at turned violent. He was arrested a few days later and has been held in prison since. His arrest and detention, to me, are understandable, although I think he should be released to face trial. The protests and the barricades are in the better off, wealthier parts of Caracas and other cities, such as Merida and San Cristobal, where they started in the state of Táchira. They're in all the major cities of Venezuela, but as I said, almost all are in the richer communities, and almost none, or maybe none, are in the barrios, people call the low income, where the popular class live. The U.S. is definitely playing a role in supporting the anti-government protests. The National Endowment for Democracy, which does not promote democracy nor respect self-determination of other societies, contributes at least $5 million a year to student and other right-wing groups that called for the overthrow of Chavez and now called for the overthrow of Maduro, and the PSUV, the party of Chavez and Maduro, the Unified Popular Socialist Party of Venezuela, which has large majorities in the General Assembly and also the state government and municipal level. The NED supported openly the governments involved in the April 2000 military coup in Chavez, and have given money to groups led by, for example, Lopez and Machado. It's possible that the right wing in Venezuela decided to organize militant street protests, including, use of Molotov cocktails, rifles against government buildings and public centers such as health clinics. And this is a guess by me, because they realized after the weak showing in the December 2013 municipal elections that they were not going to win and take power through electoral path. In other words, the popularity of the PSUV gained both in the December 2013 election. For example, from my reading of Chilean history, and I know there's some Chileans here, but I'll say anyway, the election to overthrow Allende was made after the Unidad Popular increased support in the 1972 municipal elections from the 72 showing. The Chilean right-wing and military decided elections were not going to return them to power, so they sided in a coup. Machado, Lopez, the right wing, may have reached similar conclusions for Venezuela. The central issue in Venezuela, to me, is there's a fundamental divide over the nature of Venezuelan society. For the most part, as has been clear since the failed 2002 right-wing coup, the large majority of middle-income and wealthy Venezuelans do not accept a society where they no longer call the shots culturally and politically, where they're no longer at the center at Venezuela. Racism is also central and hardly disguised by the opposition. The gains from what is often called Bolivarian revolution or el proceso or Chavismo, the gains have been made by the popular classes. Overwhelmingly, people are either indigenous, African background, or mixed European, African, indigenous origin, which a lot of people in Venezuela are. Their gains in healthcare, jobs, education, social programs, inclusion would be under severe attack if the opposition comes back to power. Those who do not accept the move toward a more socially and economically just society are disproportionately white in a country where the large majority of the population isn't. There's what's kind of ironic a little bit, historically well off have done well economically since the election in '98 of Chavez, but I think the opposition, they have lost much of their political power and fear any direction toward a democratic socialist society. They fear that, even though Venezuela, let me stress, is still a capitalist society, it's not a socialist society. Most production is organized for profit, but it's moving in a direction that obviously they oppose very much. I mean, it's true that many poor and near-poor people oppose Chavismo, and there are both people who were wealthy before '98 or become wealthy and powerful since '98 who support the PSUV-led government or a key part of it. But my point is that class and the class divide and the connected racial divide are key. class and race are essential to understand Venezuela today and the current anti-government protests, barricades, blockades. Currently, as I said, there are few protests, even signs of protest against the Venezuelan government in the barrios. Friends of mine who just wrote me in the last 2 weeks said, you don't even know there's any protests going on in most of Venezuela. The U.S. and Venezuelan mainstream media have painted a picture of Venezuela as a place of massive protest with government suppression of the media and murderous repression going on. Again, for a so-called dictatorship, which is supposed to be Venezuela, the majority of the media in today's Venezuela are private. Most of the private TV stations were actively involved in the 2002 coup attempt. The majority of Venezuelans today still watch TV owned by private corporations, most of whom are very, very hostile to what's going on. The majority of these stations and most of the newspapers, although a little bit more diverse politically than in 2002, are still very anti-government, anti-Chavista. They've not been taken off the air, prevented from printing, and the social media have not been shut down. Social media like Facebook and Twitter have been particularly active and inaccurate in portraying Venezuela as a repressive police state with total suppression of the media. The mainstream media, for example, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, NBC, have a very strong anti-Chavez bias, a very strong anti-Venezuelan government bias, and a continued hostility to building of 21st century socialism in Venezuela. The New York Times, while generally hostile to the Venezuelan revolution, with very biased reporting, has been slightly more balanced recently. They had a column by Maduro, even admitting that in the poor areas of Venezuela, there are no signs of protest. Hey, what about the repression? As far as I can tell, in some ways connected to the protests indirectly, there have been 40 deaths since the early February, since 2 months ago tomorrow, February 6th. 40 deaths over the last 2 months have been linked to the protests. But of these 40, 5 were anti-government protests killed by government security forces. So 5 out of the 40 were killed by government security forces. Of the others killed, at least 5 and maybe more have been pro-government civilians. 6 have been National Guard, people who've been, the policing some of the protests. A few have been accidents indirectly tied to the protest. For example, quite a few deaths were people who were very sick and couldn't get through the blockades in time to get medical help. At least 2 motorcyclists, probably pro-government, were beheaded by wires placed at neck level near the protest. This was a suggestion tweeted by a right-wing ex-general, Ángel Vivas. There's been overuse of force by some police and National Guard. But however, the government has arrested quite a few police and National Guard and fired others for use of excessive force and violence, therefore indicating to me that murderous repression is not a government policy. I'm saying not that it's not happened, but again, it should be put in context. Maduro has just in the last 2 days set up a Human Rights Council with national and international members, including non-government controlled human rights groups in Venezuela. And he's the charge of this, guaranteeing the free exercise of human rights and their protection and preservation, I quote. It will investigate the recent protests and disturbances. To me, it's a very hopeful sign. Also, there's begun a national dialogue on the current situation in Venezuela since February 27th, 5 weeks ago. Community organizations, government officials, the church, main business associations have been attending. For example, the owners of Polar, the largest food corporation in Venezuela, and some opposition groups. It and the Human Rights Council, which I just mentioned, are so far being boycotted by the main coalition, the MUD. Not much has come so far from this dialogue, but it may be a step toward an ongoing discussion of important issues, even though the divide in Venezuela is huge. Dialogue is fine, although I think it'd be a mistake to move the economics and politics in Venezuela in a more conservative direction to appease the right. That's what, some of the kind of few moderate people there are calling. The opposition is divided in Venezuela between those like Leopoldo Lopez and his Popular Will Party, who want to overthrow Maduro with escalating protests, and those like Capriles, the 2012-2013 opposition candidate, who's calling for a 2016 referendum that, if passed, would force Maduro to step down as president. There was a referendum to remove Chavez in 2004 that he overwhelmingly won. So let me conclude by talking about the future and what we should do here. So it seems to me the anti-government protests in Venezuela have peaked. The numbers in the protests, as well as the number of barricades, blockades, seem to be diminishing. A national dialogue about some serious problems in Venezuela is needed. However, as I said, the solution is not to bring the right wing into the government. Rather, I would argue what's needed is the opposite of what the protesters want. What's needed is a deepening of the revolution, the growth of the social economy, the growth of deepening of participatory democracy, which is part of the Venezuelan Constitution, by social economy and production that's not for profit, that's either publicly or worker-owned and worker and community controlled, which is a small part of the economy, but a very significant part. It's essential that production be increased. Socialism, to me, is about much more than providing for the basic needs and reducing poverty. I mean, those are obviously really key, but it also must be about producing most of what's consumed, and also workers' self-management, the workplace, coordinating with the communities around them. Along with workers, consumers and communities should be involved in production and consumption decisions on the environment and in coordination production, kind of democratic planning. Increasing production and productivity is essential to reducing shortage and inflation. Price controls, which Venezuela is trying now, they haven't been all successful, have a role to play, but they won't work unless there's also increasing production and more efficient distribution of inputs and final goods. Corruption, nepotism, bureaucracy, waste, as well as violent crime needs to be honestly and fully addressed and significantly reduced. This will require government commitment to better corruption, as maybe even more important, grassroots movements making demands and building power to challenge the government and the PASUV, the ruling party, when necessary. There are many, many good and honest people in the PASUV committed to a Venezuelan socialism for the 21st century, but there are also, unfortunately, many, many people who just use the words, but basically they're about advancing themselves. So there are real problems in Venezuela. However, not all protests are good just because they're protests. The aim of the current protests is to stop the advance of the gains of the Venezuelan proceso, the major and positive, although very incomplete changes since '98. This doesn't mean we should necessarily demonize all protests, but must realize the overall objective of the last 2 months of street action has been to move Venezuela under U.S. domination and to the right, to a society dominated by middle-income people, and especially by those who used to rule Venezuela. The protests in Venezuela have nothing to do with, for example, the Occupy Wall Street protests in the United States or the anti-austerity protests, for example, in places like Greece and Spain. Also, not all states or governments are bad, right? On balance, the Venezuelan state with Hugo Chavez and now Maduro have enabled some incredible, important, major and positive changes domestically and internationally. Be suspicious of governments, but remember, one size doesn't fit all. Okay, let me close then by what should we do here? Okay, and I have a few things. We should demand the end of Venezuelan funding of the opposition in Venezuela and an end to all forms of U.S. intervention in Venezuela. You know, think about how people would react here if China, Iran, openly supported the overthrow of the U.S. government and supported groups that do it. Kerry and Obama have been open about their support for the opposition to Chavez and Maduro and the Venezuelan government. The U.S. supported the attempted 2000 military coup in Venezuela. The U.S. obviously has no right to intervene in Venezuela. The right of self-determination means the Venezuelan people should decide their future, not the U.S., which has played such an unbelievably oppressive role in Venezuelan and Latin American history. Demand the U.S. not intervene in any way, oppose U.S. government resolutions that condemn the Venezuelan government to call for sanctions. 2, learn more what's going on in Venezuela. Write letters to the editor, post alternative views to the mainstream portrayal of Venezuela on Facebook, social media, etc. I suggest we as people, activists, and concerned human beings critically support the Venezuelan government against attacks on it. Alternatives to capitalism and current global capitalism are urgently needed. Let's critically support and be in solidarity with radical social movements, but also more than that. Because some people are saying we should support the social movements in Venezuela, but not the government. To me, Venezuela is a positive example, and we need a positive example where the lives of the majority are improving, and of a government that's supporting with its resources and policy the building of popular power. The communal councils, a thing called communes, which are communal councils getting together, community media, and even those slowly self-managed workplaces. The growth in access to health care and education is really inspiring. There is too much reliance on oil and oil money, but more than any country in the world, the revenues from oil are being used to reduce and end poverty. There's a growth of indigenous rights written into the Constitution, growing economic and social rights, although insufficient for women and LGBT people. There's small steps toward food sovereignty and anti-GMO policy. Although all of this is imperfect, but what other countries doing more? We should support critical support as opposed to condemnation or indifference, or even, I'm also not for uncritical support. We should learn about Venezuela and be humble and modest in our criticism. You know, we haven't built these greatest movements in the United States. I know some very serious people here. Let's not idealize and romanticize Chavez, Maduro, and the Venezuelan government, but don't let cynicism dominate our understanding and actions or being overly influenced by the mainstream media. There have been, as I've said, fundamental improvements in the lives of Venezuela, especially the inclusion of the poor, those who were formerly excluded and marginalized and told they were worth, they aren't worth much as human beings. Also very significant has been Venezuelans' role in Latin America and internationally. By playing a major role in the formation of groups such as the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas, ALBA, and the Community of Latin American States, which is basically Latin American states, Caribbean, outside of the U.S., CELAC, Venezuela has challenged and is challenging U.S. and transnational capital domination of Latin America and the world. That, and the threat of a good example, is Venezuela's crime to the rules of the United States and the global capitalist class in Venezuela. Don't fall for the CNN, Seattle Times, or even the Huffington Post and NPR perspectives on what's going on there. Our responsibility is to challenge distortion about Venezuela from our government and the media and oppose all forms of U.S. intervention. Solidarity means not only solidarity with the people and groups in Venezuela working for economic and social justice, but also with their government and economic system. It doesn't mean standing by cynically. The overthrow of the Venezuelan government would be a huge setback for people all over the world, including here, committed to ending poverty and creating an alternative to neoliberalism and global capitalism. Thank you. Si se puede.
Should I just?
Turn over, Marty.
So I guess there's nothing left to say, but I'm still going to say something. Actually, I'm going to take a little different perspective here on the story that the media isn't telling us, and I'm going to speak as a lawyer, as a member of the National Lawyers Guild, which has sent at least 7 missions to Venezuela to observe or accompany the electoral process, and has written reports. And I have also some material on the back table, clippings and information about the Lawyers Guild for anybody who's interested. But what I really want to focus on are both international law, what's not being said, as well as Venezuelan law and policy. And I'll try to skip over any areas where I might be duplicating things that you've already said, Peter. First, as a lawyer with who's excuse me, who's educated in public international law, I want to express my deep concern about the way that the U.S. media has misrepresented international law and distorted what international law is and how it applies to Venezuela. And I call your attention to the United Nations Charter, the OAS Charter, the Organization of American States Charter. Those are instruments going back to the 1940s, and the United States and Venezuela are both parties to these treaties, both members of these organizations. I don't believe there's a plan for the U.S. to withdraw from either of those organizations. It's binding law under our Constitution. Treaties are supreme law of the land. Under both the UN and OAS charters, each member state has a legal right to sovereign equality, and other states are bound to act according to the principles of political independence and of territorial integrity. You can read this in Article 2 of the UN Charter and a number of articles in the OAS Charter. Moreover, in Article 18 of the OAS Charter, it very clearly states that no one has the right to intervene directly or indirectly for any reason whatsoever in the internal affairs of another. Under Article 19 of the OAS Charter, no state, including the United States, may use or encourage the use of coercive measures of an economic or political character in order to force the sovereign will and obtain advantages of any kind from another state. So I would just submit all the recent history of the worsening of U.S.-Venezuela relations should be framed in the context of these principles of international law. And I would also like to comment on the complete, almost virtual absence of news about the December municipal, metropolitan, and indigenous elections in Venezuela in the U.S. media. It was quite interesting upon returning here to see that there were very, very brief mentions of the elections. And I think Peter has already delineated some of those reasons. I think the fact is that the elections went off without any violence. They were very normal. They were considered by the electoral observer missions, all three different groups, to be free and fair, to meet international standards. But for some reason that wasn't newsworthy for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other national media. I think one thing to take away from this get-together this afternoon is the idea that participatory democracy in Venezuela is strong, that it's expanding and developing, and that to evaluate political and social conflict without reference to their legal system, which does provide respect, protection, and fulfillment of political and other human rights, is not just intellectually dishonest, but foolish if you want to understand what's going on there. First point I'd like to make is that Venezuela has comprehensive constitutional protections for participatory democracy and human rights. Secondly, it meets and exceeds the international law standard for political rights, which is something we love to talk about in the United States. And political rights cover the right to vote, the right to be a candidate, the right to take part in public affairs, and to have equal access to participate in public service. This is all part of a treaty which the U.S. actually has ratified, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Of course, Venezuela is also a party to that treaty. And it's quite interesting that oftentimes these political rights are merely referred to as the right to vote in the United States. And I think you can draw your own conclusions about how we do with these political rights, especially in light of McCutcheon case this week. Then I'd like to mention that what I have seen and read about, that the respect for political rights in Venezuela is widespread. throughout the legal system. It includes the constitutional articles that protect political rights. It includes the law passed by the National Assembly, which is their parliamentary body. It includes the regulatory law of the National Electoral Council, which is a separate branch of government under the Venezuelan Constitution. There also are many ways in which, and we'll talk about some of those, the ways in which the state of Venezuela has promoted through education and enforced political rights and other human rights. I'm sure many of you are aware of former President Carter's assessment of the Venezuelan electoral system. He said it was the best in the world. That was after, I believe, last April's elections. And the Carter Center declined to send an observer mission for the December elections. I guess they figured that they needed to put their efforts into other countries. So I was part of a group of 50 acompañantes, an observer mission for the December 8th elections. And those included positions for mayors, positions for municipal council members, what we probably call city council members, for the heads of the metropolitan councils. There were also some indigenous representatives who were selected in these elections in a couple of the states. So all the rights that I'm going to talk about have to be understood as a highly sophisticated and advanced system of constitutional and social democracy that has evolved in the last period of Venezuelan history since the beginning of the 21st century. Its constitution, its new constitution, this is its 26th, I believe, was ratified in December of 2000, and it has 350 articles which address rights, separation of powers, and delineate the powers of government and branches of government. There are 5 sources of power. There is the legislative power, judiciary, the executive. There's citizen power, special articles relating to building citizen power, and there's, as I said earlier, electoral power. The electoral branch of government, the Consejo Nacional Electoral, the National Electoral Council, which I'm going to refer to as CNE, supervises political elections, internal elections of political parties, and union elections, among other kinds of elections. It has a very expansive power. It's a very unique kind of system that Venezuela has created. Also, I'd just like to mention, as we go along, that Venezuela has ratified just about all the United Nations human rights treaties. When Chavez was campaigning, he made rewriting the Constitution to guarantee social democracy a major part of the campaign, and he made it a priority of the first months in a year or so in office. And this was a radical project, and it resonated really well with the majority of people who, you know, I think some of the points that have already been made, who were in many ways effectively disenfranchised, who have problems with the levels of political corruption, had a lot of issues about income security despite the country's oil wealth, and who were seriously contesting the denial of other human rights. And so the process was quite an astonishing one of mobilizing people around the project of writing a new constitution, setting up a constitutional assembly, and ultimately having a popular referendum, which is also very unusual, to ratify the Constitution. So all of this happened by the end of 1999, and the Constitution actually went into effect 1 year later. The Constitution is organized into titles, and the first one has to do with the fundamental principles. And interestingly, Venezuela includes international peace as one basis for the state's existence. It also declares that it is a state based on, that has the rule of law and gives preeminence to human rights. It's a decentralized federal state, and it, of course, also rests on the sovereignty of the people. So thus the article and provisions in the Constitution that really address the building of citizen power. The Title III, which includes really a long statement of human rights, is quite an amazing portion. I recommend you're looking at it if you are so inclined. I realize not everybody likes to read legal materials, but it really is so visionary. It includes not only individual rights, which incorporate UN human rights guarantees of the civil and political rights covenant, as well as the economic, social, and cultural rights covenants, but it also has, it organizes rights into cultural and educational rights in one chapter, economic rights in another chapter, and it has a separate chapter on the rights of Native people. It also has a chapter on environmental rights. And then there's a constitutional court in the Venezuelan system that gives priority to human rights claims arising under the Constitution, and it assures individuals of prompt remedies, and remedies for that matter, and it requires the courts to enforce international tribunals' decisions as well. Some of the rights that are guaranteed by the Venezuelan Constitution, which might be why the US media is not interested in publicizing more accurate information about Venezuela, include the right to health as a social right and as part of the right to life, Article 83, a national health system, and prohibition of privatization of health assets and services, state financing of the public health system, and a health budget to attain health policy objectives, Article 85, and Social Security for all, unlike an earned social insurance system. Social and economic rights related to work and income security, which some of us think of in part as labor rights, are also addressed in this constitutional title. For example, the Constitution prohibits forced overtime, it requires paid vacations, it protects rights to non-discrimination, to organize, bargain collectively, and strike. It requires just cause for termination from employment. It requires a minimum annual salary to be adjusted each year and to be sufficient to live with dignity. The 15 Now campaign might like to take note of that. Among the civil rights specified are prohibition on slavery and servitude, prohibition on the death penalty, and a maximum sentence of 30 years. Also included are rights to due process, free expression, right to receive information, respect for physical, mental, and moral integrity, includes prohibition against torture and way more. It includes rights of movement, petition, assembly, and association, as well as freedom of conscience and religion. I mean, those are just some of the rights. You can read this yourself. And now I want to focus on, so that's the context, the broader context of human rights into which political rights fit in Venezuela. And so I'm going to devote the rest of my time to talking about that as I saw it and what the framework is. International human rights law, which includes the treaty I mentioned, the Civil and Political Rights Treaty, and some other interpretive documents like the general comment, as well as judicial decisions. What is required for political rights are the following. One, that states give each citizen the right to vote. That's universal. On the basis of equal representation, one person, one vote, without any distinctions, which is interpreted to mean no discrimination. And discrimination is on the categories, the broad categories listed in the Civil and Political Rights Treaty, which are broader than U.S. law, and with minimal restrictions. Restrictions must be subject to objective and reasonable criteria. Voting may be limited to citizens, although distinctions in the right to vote may not be made on the basis of how citizenship was acquired. There's a different standard for running for office. Right. Citizens who are entitled to vote are also required to have governmental assistance in overcoming barriers to vote, such as illiteracy, language, poverty, impediments to freedom of movement. The state has an obligation under international law to ensure the effective exercise of the vote. It also has an obligation to achieve an informed electorate, to provide voter education and voter registration campaigns. The power to take part in public affairs may be exercised directly or through representatives freely chosen. Elections are required to be periodic and through secret ballot. Persons not convicted are entitled to vote. Deprivation of the vote, if based on conviction, must be proportional to the sentence and offense. This is international standard. Voters have the right to be candidates for electoral office, and candidates should be subject only to reasonable, non-discriminatory fees, deposits, nomination dates, and other conditions. Voters are entitled to a free choice of candidates. The right to participate in public affairs requires an ability to participate in all aspects of public administration and in formulating local, regional, national, and international policies. The right requires that representatives are held accountable and act within constitutional, legal, and legal powers. Citizens must also have the right to change their constitution and decide referenda. And of course, the right to participate in public affairs necessitates civil rights of expression, association, assembly, basically rights that permit people to engage in dialogue and debate with representatives. So those are the international standards. And in the Venezuelan Constitution, political rights are addressed in several articles. They're in 62 through 64, the freedom to participate directly and through representatives requires the state to facilitate political participation. Elections are required to be free, direct, universal, and secret, and proportional representation is mandated with voting at age 18. And in state, municipal, and parish elections, foreign nationals who've lived in the country for 10 plus years are also entitled to vote under the Venezuelan Constitution. Venezuela also gives voters the right to have transparent and periodic accounting from their public representatives. It requires laws to regulate political and education campaigns, including duration and spending limits, with a view to pursuing its democratization. It also provides a right to demonstrate peacefully and without weapons, and prohibits use of firearms and toxic substances to control peaceful demonstrations. It offers, Article 70 offers broad protection for participation in public affairs. This is a very interesting provision, constitutional provision. This also gives rights to have a voice, to vote, to economic ownership. This includes like self-management, cooperatives, co-management, and other forms of association. So the notion of participation in public affairs in Venezuela is very broad, and some of the political participation language in the Constitution also applies to areas that we would probably think of as economic participation. So I want to just mention a few things about my experience in December. As I said, there were three missions, 50 of us. There was UNASUR, which was the largest group. That's the Union of South American Nations, which is really superbly well organized, and they're the replacement for the OAS, and they do a really fine job. It's the spokespeople for UNASUR were a congressional leader from Ecuador and an electoral judge from Uruguay. And there were members from Brazil, Argentina, Ecuador, Colombia, Guyana. It was a very diverse group. And then there was another mission called from UNIORE, which is the Inter-American Union of Electoral Organizations. And that was headed up by TSE, the Supreme Electoral Tribunal member from El Salvador, which to me was really wonderful to see, as I had been an election observer in El Salvador right after the war, and the TSE had really very low status, was not considered a very capable organization. So it's really great to see the leadership being exerted by the Salvadorans as part of this organization. And then I was with this really oddly named a small group. We were called guild organizations, academics, intellectuals, and other electoral associations. And there were 4 of us from the Lawyers Guild, 2 academics from the UK and Dominican Republic, and 4 individuals who actually have electoral positions and who came from Bolivia, Congo, France, and South Africa. So it was really a fantastic opportunity to learn also about other people's electoral systems, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. And I just wanted to mention the convening address by the head of the CNE, Tibisay Lucena. There's a picture with some of us in our group on the back table. I thought her situating of where Venezuela is and where Latin America is at this point in terms of elections was really very apt. She said that Venezuela has experienced an evolution in its view of democracy, away from democracy as the province of the politicians and toward a diverse reality that is participatory and protagonist. And she recognized a new role for voters who are educated about their power, mindful of their co-responsibility as citizens, and who claim their political rights along with their other human rights. The CNE, as she mentioned, that they'd conducted 40 electoral processes from 1998 to 2013, an average of a couple every year. I think this is the first year that there's no elections going on in Venezuela. The 2013 elections involved 2,700 offices, and there were about 16,000 candidates. I don't want to get into details because I think about the elections particularly, except that it's really an advanced system, entirely electronic, amazingly sophisticated. There's a pictographic voting card. The secrecy of the ballot is guaranteed in part through the national identity and national voting card, as well as through thumbprint matching. We went to the place where the machines are put together and, and sealed, et cetera. They're actually not made in Venezuela. I guess there's a hope that they will be able to get a license to manufacture them there, but I think they're from a European country that I can't think of right now. Anyway, a couple of things I wanted to mention about the participation, which I think is the participatory part of the political rights and democracy. The CNE has really been working hard to live up to its obligation under the Constitution to increase participation, and I think this is probably another area where some media sources in the U.S. might really not want to tell us about this too. They've almost completed their project to automatically register all 18-year-olds. They're over 90% complete with that. And you won't have to requalify in Venezuela, and there's no problem with being removed from the voting rolls. They also offer, I learned through discussion, that anybody who's in detention who hasn't been convicted is entitled to vote, and they actually offer voting in detention. I mentioned also that the voting standard relating to those who've been convicted of crimes in Venezuela, anybody who completes a sentence is automatically able to resume voting. There's no bar. There is a provision in the Constitution that restricts or allows for restrictions on candidates who've been convicted of offenses related to political office and public property. So that's the bar. The bar extends to the candidates who have a conviction in an area that's related to trust in office. For the December balloting, the voting materials were in 15 languages. They produced about, I think, 5 million booklets. They had 2 or 3 fairs in every municipality to explain the voting process. They claim to have reached 3.6 million people. And of course, there was a lot of media coverage in newspaper and television. There are about 7 major newspapers, and most of those are opposition papers, but there's lots and lots of information, not just advertising about campaigns. There was a report prepared last August by the CNE for the UN Human Rights Committee on its compliance under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and they specifically discussed participation among Afro-Venezuelans and indigenous peoples. And they documented that the participation rate had increased by around 20% from 98 for each of these groups. They, for Afro-Venezuelans, and these are just presidential election data that I have because I don't have the other, for presidential elections, participation of Afro-Venezuelans went from 55.8% in 98 to 75.8% in 2012. And for indigenous voters in that same time frame, the participation rate went from 52% to 73%. But I'm going to assume that pattern was probably followed for the December elections. The actual percentage of participation, it was a bit over 58% for municipal elections, which is rather high internationally, and we could talk about that. So I think I'm going to just stop. I can talk about some of the recommendations our team made, or comparing Venezuela with U.S. or whatever. But I think I've talked enough. If we need time for questions. Thanks.
So Romy, I was watching Angela, and Romy told me when Marty was talking about the electoral system, when are we going to get those things
right,
here in the
and
United
the international
States?
standards that
Right,
apply here.
Right. much less allowing all those who have served their terms in prison and jails to vote. That would make a huge difference in this country, especially in terms of the African-American community. So anyway, I do just want to share just one short story. When I was in Venezuela in 2003, they were amending the Constitution. And in the plaza, there were all these copies of the Constitution being sold.
Yeah.
And everyone had their Constitution. If you asked a Venezuelan about the Constitution, they would pull their copy of the Constitution out of their pocket and look for the section that you're asking for. And so when Marty says people take their participation in the knowledge of their society, their participation in the electoral arena, very serious. I mean, that really spoke to me. Oh, they want you. That really spoke to me, because where in the United States do you find anybody carrying, except for maybe Gary Owens, a copy of the Constitution, and know what's in our Constitution. So that was amazing to me, that people would know their Constitution and carry it with them. That's how serious they took it. So I think we're going to go ahead and, first of all, I want to know, how many of you have been to Venezuela here? Okay, so there's a number of you that have been here and, can help participate in the discussion as well. We want this to be a dialogue, not just question and answers. So, and I know that many of the folks here who have been to Cuba can also relate to the role that Venezuela has played in relationship and vice versa, what Cuba has contributed to Venezuelan society. Because when I was there, also again in my different trips with my niece Mary, there were Cubans everywhere, teachers, doctors, healthcare personnel, women who were training other women in Venezuela. So I hope this can be a good dialogue for the next half hour we have. Good. So, floor is open. Can you speak up, because this is being taped? Just stand up. Stand up.
Okay, Gary.
I'm not a student at you. I haven't been to Venezuela, but I have studied lots of different things. And I was wondering, after understanding what happened in Guatemala in 1964, where obviously the CIA, through some conviction of their own, the direction that they got from the Eisenhower or whoever, to basically take that country's reform democracy back from them and put it in a different context. Some years later, we had the Bay of Pigs, same kind of thing. And that's happened all over the world, because the United States, so-called diplomacy and the military. Did you get any notion, those of you that have been to Venezuela or those of you that are presenting, any notion that that is in the back of people's minds? Are they afraid that the United States would use that kind of intervention to create the dynamic of democracy that you all present?
I don't think that the Venezuelans are afraid of the United States. I think they're concentrating on building their democracy, and I think the article that Maduro, the op-ed that he wrote in the New York Times, is emblematic of the pride that people have of what they've created. However, I do think that our role in this room should be, and as we leave here, should be to prevent the U.S. from engaging in regime change, which is illegal. In fact, that phrase should be challenged every time you hear it, because it's illegal. And this is something that I feel very passionately about, is why is international law not considered law? And so I think that, and the issue that Peter raised, may have more comments on that, but I also feel that we should be working to cut off the funding for groups which attempt to influence the political independence of another country. That's also a question of legality, not only a question of economics, but, I think we have to keep raising that.
So I think, there is some fear in Venezuela, particularly the past president of Colombia, Uribe, when the U.S. was building bases there, and there was really a fear that through Colombia and the U.S. there'd be attacked. With the present president of Colombia, Santos, the relationships have improved between Venezuela and Colombia, so that fear has diminished. A difference, I think, from Venezuela compared to Guatemala that you mentioned, or let's say Chile, which I referred to in the early 70s, is that Chavez, for example, came out of the military, and there always was this small revolutionary current in the military. When there was a 2002 coup with the military, together with the mainstream union and the main business federation, had a 48-hour coup. There was a big division in the military. Afterwards, you've had most of the leadership that supported the coup were replaced. And the military has been very involved there in kind of construction, social programs. They've tried to, the revolution has tried to maintain kind of the military within the society as a whole, as opposed to being outside. Again, it's very, very uneven. But for the United States, for example, to use the Venezuelan military, I think, is a much more difficult thing than it was in some of the other places like Guatemala that you've mentioned.
I think, did you have a question? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that a lot of us don't know what our own government is doing, and even what our government is, all this, this knowledge about the Constitution or whatever. And Pete had asked me if I had any information about the National Endowment for Democracy, which I think every single person should know. All you have to do is to Google National Endowment for Democracy, which has been in Venezuela since 1997. Its mission is to find dissension, or where there is some kind of division, and then give people non-traceable phones, faxes, all this high-tech stuff, find a way to foment division. And this sounded awful to me, but worse, in doing research on it, it's legislated. And I'm going to tell you that counterpunch.org had a great article called The National Endowment for Democracy in Venezuela. I brought it especially to share that information with whoever was here. According to this, a president couldn't even change this without going into Congress and everything.
Right.
It's a legislative intervention with money.
Right.
And looking, and it's called the Democracy Promotion Program. And we don't know anything about, I didn't know any of the details about the National Endowment for Democracy until I did some research on Cuba. But it's everywhere. The Ukraine, it's everywhere. It is financed by our tax dollars all over the world to get American corporate power driven into whatever soil there is. I think this is a major job for us to be aware of. And I confess I was totally ignorant of how deep this went.
There's an article that I brought too that's on the back table, an interview with a person who's been involved in both Cuba and Venezuela that came out recently. And the other thing to add to this about the fact is that it's a corporate agenda and it has the support of the members of Congress, your representatives. And the other piece is that the approach is to confuse, and it relies, there's this interesting book that I'm reading now by Mirowski about what is the name of that
You said it
book?
to me, but I don't
A
remember.
good crisis is, anyway, I'll tell you in a sec. Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste, in which
Good
he
title.
lays out actually how the process of creating confusion, the way in which the U.S. does it. Now, it has done it through the CIA, but this, what you're talking about now, the NED, is totally out in the open, and so the idea is you create confusion first and you build ignorance. And if you look, and that's one reason why we have to keep talking about Venezuela and we have to break through this, because it's also being created here. And so, but it's not like a stray thing. He talks about how this was used on us to keep us quiet about what Wall Street did in 2008 and the cover-up. So, we have to break out of. So, if we can break out of this, we could also change our foreign policy.
Go ahead.
Thanks for sharing. I've been really, really wanting to have a conversation about this. I've been having a lot of conversations, but it's actually been with my peers who are normally would never go to a protest with me, would never be into that, but they are so opinionated about Venezuela and wanting to get involved and are participating in the protests throughout the U.S. in solidarity with protesters in Venezuela, and are saying, this is so important. This is not, if I would have to say, oh, okay, but I'm a little bit afraid that they're saying that this is, about Maduro being evil and that we need to stop the violence, but really the alternative that they're suggesting is to put the right wing and the, U.S. domination into power instead. But they're saying, no, it's not about ideologies. This is just about peace. And I think we've heard this a lot before, and I really like how you were saying we can't just say protests are always good because they're protests. But how would you explain, how would you say to my Venezuelan American friends who are saying to my face, crying, my cousin is being tortured right now because he's involved in the protest? Do you have any suggestions for how to have this dialogue and frame it in a way, especially coming from my position as a white, privileged, upper-class American who has never been to Venezuela?
You first.
Well, I was thinking I was addressing my talk prior to that, and I've had a fair number of discussions. I gave a similar talk a few weeks ago in Olympia, right? And there was some, I would say, not super right-wing, but conservative Venezuelans there, and we definitely went back and forth. And the thing I was trying to stress, I think there are real problems there, but it's not a police state. That's why I mentioned numbers of who's being killed. Secondly, I think if you look at pictures, look who the protesters are. Look how they're dressed. Look at their skin color compared to Venezuela as a whole. So that's why I'm saying not that everybody's protesters is honest, but I think the class, race stuff, who's protesting, who's not, how different it is, let's say, because I know I've spent some time the last few years in Greece where there's, incredible economic problems, but also huge resistance. It's a really different class of people from those who are protesting in Venezuela. So that is not full, because I think it's true that in the United States, I'm not sure how different it is from, let's say, the Cuban population here. Most of the Venezuelan population in the United States is conservative. It doesn't mean everything they're saying is just made up, but I think the sources are just so dishonest. The Venezuelan media, from spending time there, it's basically Fox News. I'm talking about the Venezuelan media there. It's much more right-wing even than the CNN, New York Times, even I think the mainstream U.S. media, like the New York Times, is to me so much more biased. I think Venezuela, Cuba, and Palestine seem to me where it's the most biased in the right-wing direction too. But I don't think it's easy, and it's such a class-divided country, and I think you have to, people there have to acknowledge it, ask them who their sources are, what some of the gains are. So and I can talk to you about the sources if you want at the end also.
Well, and I think also one of the points that I've been trying to make is that Venezuela has a structure, political structure, for more participation than almost any other place. And if people think that violent protests, like putting barbed wire up in the streets to garrote people on motorcycles, or to use weapons, if they think violent protest is okay, then you have to have a conversation about why, if there are all these other opportunities for participation, do you seek to use violence? And that's maybe a conversation. But also the issue about who benefits from regime change, it gets back to class and racial issues, but it also, the whole question about the social and economic indicators, I find that a lot of people who themselves are very comfortable in the U.S. don't really accept that these are rights for other people, the right to have food security, the right to have work, and so forth, and so you may have to have a lot more discussion about some of those areas that might not be in the foreground.
Is this on this?
I went to Venezuela 4 years ago as a media person, and I sought out the right-wing students, because it is right-wing students, and the student movement. I mean, there's left-wing student movement that's in the community colleges.
Right.
The right-wing student movement, which is what you hear about, is all in the elite universities. So I sought them out and interviewed them. And I also sought out people who were, more pro. Like, for instance, I went to a community TV station and I interviewed the TV people.
That's cool.
And so I kind of felt like I interviewed people from the spectrum. And when I was talking to the right-wing students who were proud that they had tasted the tear gas in the street, that they had been shot at by rubber bullets and this and that, in some ways, it was the rhetoric and stuff was very similar to an American activist, who's proud that they were out there in the streets raising hell on their cause and stuff like that. And I kept saying, that was all interesting enough to me, but my point being this. None of them had been shot. None of them had been actually tortured. The ones I talked to had maybe been tear gassed, had been present when some rubber bullets had been used. When I came back, I happened to be talking to this cop in a coffee shop, and I said, gosh, I was just down there doing it. He says, well, any of them getting killed? And I said, no, it's rubber bullets and tear gas. He said, well, hell, we do that here. It totally swayed him, as a policeman. And my experience in talking to the students who were frank, they first of all, they weren't afraid to talk to me. Second of all, they clearly were, they were signing petitions. Well, people who were living in a Gestapo kind of country don't sign petitions. They were signing petitions. They were, out there doing whatever they're doing with their faith, without their faith being hidden, And when they got out of hand, they started breaking windows. When I talked to them more, the times when they had gotten the rubber bullets and things had been like that, when they were doing bad things that no protesters should actually do, And sure, when they would go do bad stuff and start trying to burn down a government building or break windows or do all that kind of crap, then the police would stop them, That was when they were getting anything, and what they were getting was frankly not repressive, in my opinion, and as a guy who's eaten plenty of tear gas in America, for left-wing causes, but it just, so I feel very comfortable just calling bullshit on bullshit. And I'm really alarmed for instance, I was watching the Academy Awards, and one of the actors got up and said, and in solidarity with the Ukraine and Venezuela, you know, blah, blah, it's like, what? You know, it's like mushing this all together, and it really, in my opinion, is the U.S. trying to take, you know, people know that there's these movements going on around the world, there's all these other peoples, and they're just trying to lump that one in there. And 4 years ago when I was there, the truth is that the demonstrators were sort of despondent. They said, yeah, we used to go out there and bang the cans every time Chavez would have a speech, you know, we used to this and that, but, you know, after a while, you know, now nobody's showing up for the damn demonstrations anymore. It's really hard to be a right-wing activist, you know, it's kind of like they were bummed. You know, now Chavez is dead, you can just see that they're seeing their opportunity, both because Chavez is gone and because there's all these other peoples around the world, and they can sort of, the right, you know, the imperialists, you know, the propagandists for the right wing, can kind of try and mush those right-wing students who don't even represent the student movement. I mean, there's a genuine student movement of leftists, you know, that are like pro the Bolivarian revolution. But they're in the community colleges, and of course they don't ever get talked about. You know, it's easy enough to find out. You know. Anyway, my own personal experience just going and hanging out. You know, I walk around with no organization, nobody steering me or trying to direct me or drawing my attention away from things or anything of the sort. Was that you know, most people were really. I'll give you one example. So I wanted to go take some pictures of graffiti. I always take pictures of graffiti wherever I go. That's one of the things I love to do. And I've got a few pictures that I'll give to people for free if they help fund the media or do something good for this movement. But so I was trying, you know, my Spanish is crappy. So I was talking to the cabbie, and I was trying to get the cabbie. You know, I figured he would know what graffiti was. Right? So, you know, show me things and places that are some signs of the revolution. You know, because I didn't know exactly how to say graffiti in Spanish. He says, okay. And he drove me over to the corporate headquarters of the oil company. I was like, shut up. Yeah, what's this? And he says, well, you own the oil. And I realized, oh, he's being pretty profound, and I was being sort of really superficial, you know. So I took a picture, you know, and said, thank you, and we'll take this some more. He was still hopeful that I'd find some graffiti. And so he drove me over to this bank. I was like, the bank? He said, well, the people own the bank. And he was just a cabbie, a random cabbie, you know. But he had this profound understanding that what was going on in his country was really, really cool, you know. And he was really, really proud of that fact. Eventually, I finally got into taking some graffiti, and I thought it was, but I had to go to the oil company bank first. And frankly, his understanding was much better than mine. You know, I was humbled by that response. You know. So anyway, all I'm saying is that when people run that, when people want to mush the movements together, I think as progressive people in the United States, we've got to just say, you know, that's a bunch of bullshit. You know, and there are sources. Here's people that have been going multiple times, and, you know, whatever. There are people that go there, and what we're hearing now is the media bullshit, and it really is just bullshit.
So while we're on the media, for people, because we can't rely on our media or Venezuelan media, we would recommend you go to www.venezuelaanalysis.com, right?
And one A, Venezuelan analysis, right? 1A.
1A. And that can give you some very good day-to-day coverage of what's happening in Venezuela and analysis. I just have one, I think, really good example of how corrupt the media in Venezuela is because it's so privately owned. When I was there for an international women's conference that the Chavez government completely funded, brought women from all over the world to discuss a women's rights agenda, and brought women from all over Venezuela to talk with women from around the world. Chavez addressed the assembly and was speaking about one of the national heroines of Venezuela, and was holding a flower in his hand, a rose in his hand, extending, you know, his, talking about how women in Venezuela have historically and will continue to play such a decisive role in Venezuelan, the transition of the Venezuelan society. So he was pictured like this with a rose in his hand. The next day, on the cover of one of the major dailies in Venezuela, the rose had been replaced by a gun, saying that he will, through any means, essentially any means necessary, and using violence, that he will, transform the society. So, that's how blatant, their media is in terms of, misconstruing what happens.
Even though one thing I think we really learned from Venezuela is, okay, so that was 2003, right? 2002 was the coup, and basically the attempted coup, and there was almost no public media at the time. So most of the media was very much saying this democratic coup had taken place, kind of a strange concept. But since 2003 particularly, there's been an incredible growth of community media. Mainly TV and radio. So in a lot of these communal council communities that I visited, we traveled all over Venezuela and talked to a lot of different kind of people too. People would have their own radio stations and TV stations. Sometimes they would take money from the government, and they said if they did, as far as they were worried, but they still had autonomy. They could do whatever they wanted. And others, like in Merida, the community radio station there, they wouldn't take any money, even though they said they weren't, nothing had really happened, but they felt they could have more autonomy that way. So I think this growth of community media is something that I think is really substantial there, and another really positive part of what's going on.
So I think we have time for one other question, because we said we would be done by 5 o'clock. Anybody for a comment?
You said that 90% of 18-year-olds are automatically registered.
Oh, more than 90%, they're transitioning so that everybody will be automatically registered at age 18. Yeah. Well, it's easier to do if you have a national identity card. But, so, there are some issues with identity cards, I think, that would make it hard to do in here, and, but throughout Latin America, they have a system of identity cards, and so that automatically registering people doesn't seem that difficult to do. But yeah, there's a real commitment to participation. There's no, not only is it, constitutionally mandated, but people really feel that it's important for everybody to mobilize. And even, I had a conversation with somebody who is obviously very opposition-oriented, who is my seatmate on the airplane when I was leaving, and it was, and I said, at least people vote, at least people participate. She looked at me in disbelief, and she said, well, yeah, we do participate. And in Venezuela actually has had higher participation rates than almost all the rest of Latin America for quite a long time. So the fact is, people feel passionately about politics.
Both sides.
And yeah, but I think it's because the success really of the electoral system and the participation that now those who really are not of goodwill and who are not willing to have democratic, a democratic structure start to become ascendant and use violent means. Because even, Capriles after the December elections basically had lost status. Although the MUD won 3 of the largest cities, they won the mayoral elections. It wasn't just like a landslide for the PSUV, and I should also mention that there were even, for some of the mayoral races, there were combined ballots with PSUV and MUD. They're not, at local levels for local kinds of problems, there's more coming together than you might realize. It's not completely polarized. So it's a very interesting society. There's, I think the question is whether people who might have been dragged, into the rightist camp or who are leaning that way could still come on. I think there are sort of people in the middle who might become part of the project for Transform Society if some of these really problematic economic issues, including the inflation and so forth, if those can, and really an attention to international, I mean, into development of the country can begin to get addressed. It's a very dynamic society, and I really respect the fact that that people are so committed, sometimes negatively.
So just lastly, there have been a couple of bills in Congress.
Right.
Can
There's
you briefly?
the sanctions bill, maybe you're probably more familiar, and I have some material, the letter back there, I think, in opposition to sanctions on the table, but that's one thing that everybody should go away from here and make sure that you've communicated with your representatives and senators that sanctions against Venezuela are not what is desirable, nor should we be funding destabilization in Venezuela. I think that's something that we should continue working on.
How strongly is that being supported in Congress? The sanctions?
They have a lot of votes. They have all kinds of people. And this is, the problem that's brought up here about, the class issues and people who have, that's why I think that the people in the middle who are still open and who are of goodwill and not committed to violent ends, that it's really important to get things, to have more dialogue and to try to move some of those people away from this aggressive and negative foreign policy direction. Also, Maduro asked to exchange ambassadors in that op-ed piece, which is another thing, we could talk about normalizing relations.
Okay, thank you all, and thanks for our presenters.
A whole bunch of